When a cellular telephone user places a call, the carrier transmits the caller's voice as well as the voice of the person who is called. The encoded voices are the data of the call. In addition to transmitting the data, the carrier also stores metadata. The metadata of the call include information such as the time the call is placed and the phone numbers of both participants. For which of the following goals would it be more useful to computationally analyze the metadata instead of the data? So we need to find out which one of these goals, these three statements, would it be more useful to analyze the metadata, which is like the data about the call, like the time it is placed and the phone numbers of the participants, rather than the data, which is the actual conversation in the call. So the first statement says to determine if a caller frequently uses a specific word. So obviously for this one here, we would rather look at the data than the metadata. So it would not be very useful to analyze the metadata in this case, because whether a caller uses a word frequently, you would need to actually know the words used in the conversation, which means you would need to analyze the data in the call, not the metadata. The time the call is placed and who is being called is not going to tell us how frequently a specific word is used in the call. We need to actually look in the data of the call, the actual words in the conversation. So statement one is not correct. It wouldn't be useful to analyze the metadata instead of the data. Second statement says to estimate the number of phone calls that will be placed next Monday between 10:30 a.m. and noon. So to estimate the number of phone calls that will be placed between Monday and between 10:30 a.m. and noon on Monday, so between in a certain time period, it would be much more useful to analyze metadata, because metadata tells us the times that calls are placed. And if we look at previous history of when calls were placed, we can use that information to estimate how many calls or how many average calls, the number of average calls that are taking place between 10:30 a.m. and noon on Mondays, to estimate how many will be occurring next Monday. So yes, since this information requires, in order to estimate this, requires that we know the times that calls are placed, it is much more useful to look at the metadata. Third statement says to generate a list of criminal suspects when given the telephone number of a known criminal. So in this case, it would be much more useful to use metadata, because since we know the telephone number here and we want to generate a list of criminal suspects, then all we would need to do is find out which numbers that this telephone number called. This telephone number belongs to the known criminal, so whatever number this calls are numbers that the criminal has called. So we can look at the metadata to see the phone numbers of both participants of the conversations going on in the calls, and just filter it where one of the participants is the number of the known criminal, which means this known criminal in this filter data is talking to some other phone number, some other person, and we would just add those people to our criminal suspects list. So the metadata, knowing who is in a conversation, would be useful in this case, rather than the actual content of the call when generating a list of suspects. So that means answer choice C is correct, because statement 2 and 3 were examples where it would be useful to look at the metadata instead of the data.